what I'm going to do today is talk about an idea that Mark Bergower and myself, Mark, is some sheep on Twitter, if you like to, if you're a Twitter user, that we have been working on for a number of years. It kind of sees us use Wardley Maps in a different context or slightly different context. So we have adapted and we'd argue created a new practice that uses the same material, Wardley Maps, but has a different meaning and requires some different skills to do. My starting position here is that Wardley Maps are a tool that can be used for different practices, and that Wardley mapping and what we currently call maturity mapping are two different practices. And I'll kind of round out with that at the end, but I'll talk you through why as we go through. My name is Chris McDermott. I am a agile lean coach with kind of two jobs. That's over the last few years, the last decade, I guess I've always seemed to have two jobs. My two jobs now are as a lean agile coach, as I just said, and as an organisational researcher. So where we use the ideas that I'll present today to understand how organisations work in order to help them change. And there is an overlap there. I use maturity mapping quite a lot in my coaching as well. My previous second job was as a conference organiser, where I organised Lean Agile Scotland, which continues to run in Edinburgh. I started organising that around 2011. And Lean Agile Glasgow, which is a community group which has been going 10 years strong. And I found out the other week that it has not missed an event every second Wednesday of the month for 10 years since we started it. Okay, so as part of this session, I'm going to ask you to do something very, very small thing. It won't take long at all, but it helps illustrate one of the core concepts that we're going to talk about. So you'll need at hand a pen and paper. A post-it note and a Sharpie will do, but some sort of writing implement and something to write on is what's required. What I'm going to talk about today, or the journey I'm going to take you on, is it starts with a conversation in Edinburgh, funnily enough, at Lean Agile Scotland. I ask a question about execution. What is it about execution? We'll talk a little bit about what is capability. We'll talk then about how do we know what we have, and then kind of round out about how we can change. How can we change the capabilities? So the afternoon in Edinburgh, let's begin there. This was, so if it was Lean Agile Scotland, it'd be October, maybe late September 2019. And Mark and I had just finished running a sort of introductory workshop to maturity mapping that Simon had attended. With a bunch of others, and at the end of the session, Simon came up and asked, in only the way Simon could, the question: what the fiddlesticks is social practice theory? What is this social practice theory you're talking about? Can't quite explain it well enough and how it integrated into maturity mapping. And to be fair, maybe 2 years ago it was a fairly early concept. Maybe we were kind of getting to grips with it. Over the last couple of years, we've got much more attuned to it. So we did talk about social practice theory. We talked about the meanings, the materials, the competencies of practice. We'll come on to that later. We had a lovely conversation about co-evolution and in the relationship to practice and practice theory. And then we had a conversation about rural payments. And so rural payments is something that it's a subsidy that's provided to farmers in Scotland, and I suspect the wider UK. But here in Scotland, it's something that's provided to farmers by a directorate of the Scottish Government called the Agricultural, Rural and Economy, or ARE for short. And what they had just experienced was a failed IT project. That's why we were talking about them, neither as our farmers, so it wasn't for that purpose. But what they had attempted to do was automate every single payment. So they kind of had a purpose they were working towards, but they didn't understand the landscape, their client, the climate, the doctrine. They just made a decision: we're going to automate all of the things. So this scribble is, I believe, if I recall rightly, it's not mine, it's Simon's scribble from that discussion. Let me try and make it a little bit clearer. So Simon argued that the reason for the failure of this project, despite his advice and despite speaking to them, they attempted to automate everything and at great cost. They didn't look at the characteristics of an application for a subsidy. And they didn't look at the ones they received and then decide on a strategy based on how to deal with them. Simon suggested they should. So you can see here that on the right-hand side of the map in commodity, you have a whole series of applications which have a very low variability. They have the processing of an application that can be seen as very algorithmic, repetitive, ideal for automation. But for the rest, where there's a degree of complexity to them, they require some sort of heuristical evaluation. This is something that should be done by teams. So automate the commodities and have teams work on the more complex applications. So voila, you have potential for a strategy here informed by maps. When I think about strategy, I'm often brought back to this quote by Russell Ackoff, a systems thinker, where he says, the more efficient you are at doing the wrong thing, the wronger you become. It's much better to do the right thing wronger than the wrong thing righter. It's an absolute tongue twister. I have to read it. I could never remember that and say it correctly. Sort of Peter Drucker says a similar thing. There is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. So in essence, what Ackoff and Drucker are saying is that strategy trumps execution. Actually having the right strategy is the more important thing than execution, having the ability to execute well. I think Simon also says similar in his keynote. He gave at Lean Scotland maybe 2015. He sort of described this and has a slide for it. Not that I want to argue that these three gentlemen are wrong, but what I think there is there's a relationship between strategy and execution. There is a feedback loop provided in there. So I actually think your ability to execute provides a feedback loop to your strategy and so on. So to be Ackoff-esque, if you want to do the right thing, you're going to have to learn to do the thing right. So those teams we were talking about at the ARD, the Agricultural Rural Economy Directorate, have to have the capability to execute that strategy, or in essence, the strategy is worthless. And also, it's not just about execution in any old way. It's about how an organisation changes to execute in the most efficient way, the way that best meets the evolving and changing needs of its customers. So how does it mature and continuously improve its capabilities to deliver? And then with that, you have the feedback loop that generates more strategic options. There's more things that the organisation can then explore. Okay, so in case you haven't already guessed, what I'd like to share is how maturity mapping can help with change and understanding how to execute better. Very simple question then, what is execution? Just so we're all clear. It's carrying out of a plan or order or course of action. It's the ability to do something. One small note here is I've never worked at the Agricultural Rural Economy. I have done a fair bit of work over the last few years in the Scottish Government and now find myself in a directorate of Scottish Government who are responsible for the payment of pensions to public sector workers. And they're kind of seeing a similar problem that ARE encountered. So delivery is doing, execution is doing, and to do that, you require to have the ability. You have to have the capability to do. Very obvious statement. So the question here is, that I'm trying to pose that maturity mapping can help us answer, is how do we understand the capabilities we have, the capabilities we need, and the change required to be able to effectively deliver? So there's three sub-questions I think that emerge from this. In an organisation or a socio-technical system, what is a capability? How do you know what capabilities we have? And how do you know what we can change? So let's start by going through those questions then. What is a capability? Let's tick our way through. So a capability, it's a network of things we do that interact to produce a capability greater than that of the individual parts. So let's repeat that again. It's a network of things we do that interact to produce a capability greater than that of the individual parts. So it's a way of talking about larger things we're able to do, things we're able to do because of the many things that maybe our teams do, or that individuals do, or that groups do. So we have for example, we have a capability to build a software system because we do research, we can do analysis, we can do development, we can do testing, etc., etc., etc. And if we look at the simple example I've put on the screen here, we have the capability, or there is a capability, we may not have it, I assume we do, to send a letter. And there are certain things you need to be able to do to send a letter. Well, you need to be able to write a letter, put it in an envelope, buy a stamp, post it, blah, 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 blah. These are all things we do that come together, that integrate together to give us this greater capability. Okay, so let me delve a little deeper here and ask the question, what is it that we do? So we're to understand our capabilities, and if I'm positing that our capabilities are the integration of many smaller things we do that give us a larger thing that makes more sense to us to consider, what is it that we do? Okay, so this is the point where I'm going to ask you to get out your pen and paper. And I can't see you, so I'm going to have to trust that you're all doing this, or at least trust that you'll get an understanding of the example. So I want you to take the pen and put it in your other hand, not the hand you predominantly write with. And then I want you to write your name. As simple as that. Just take the pen, put it in your other hand, and write your name. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Try not to write on the table because you're using your other hand. Make sure you try your best to keep it on the paper. Okay, I'm assuming you've done that. The feedback loop here on remote conferences is rather poor, but I assume you've done that. So congratulations. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Great feedback there. Thumbs and duns. So congratulations. You have just performed a social practice. Yeah, something that you can do routinely, you can share, you can describe, and you can adapt. Social practices exist everywhere and everything we do. So social practice also gives us something that we can analyze and understand that intricate dance that takes place between what I'll just describe in a second, the various elements of a practice. So again, social practice is something that's routine, it's shared, and it's reproducible. It's made up of 3 elements. These 3 elements are, first, meanings. So to do something, think about what you've just done in writing your name. You've taken part in the exercise. That might be the meaning for it. You might want to share your name, yeah. But the purpose, the needs, the drivers, the motivations is one key element. They are one key element. The meanings of practice. The next one to then consider is materials. To perform a practice, we need a thing. Things play a part. Whether that's, and this is quite a broad thing to consider, but it's the tools we use. If we're software developers, it could be the code we write, it could be the products we build, the products we use. It's, it's the pen and paper on the table you just use to write your name. It's also places and where practice is done. And finally, in the blue circle there, we have competence, we have skills, we have a know-how, the ability to do the practice. My friend Jay Bloom lovely describes a practice as having the skills to manipulate the material in order to meet the meaning, to close that loop. So your competence, your skills, knowledge, your propositional knowledge, in this case, I know my name, how it's spelled, procedural knowledge, I know how to write letters, participatory knowledge, I know what skills to apply and to what degree. It's who have the competence. So if we think a little bit further, if we're happy with that description, we think a little further, thinking of these three elements, what changes if I ask you to do to sign your name? What might change in this idea of practice? You can either type or I'll just keep talking. It's okay. So I would suggest when you're signing your name, the chances are the meaning has changed. The purpose has changed. Skills have changed. The competence in writing, signing your name has changed. You're likely to not sign your name in a very kind of obvious block capillary way. So your skill has to change in how you repeatedly do it. The purpose have changed because you're likely to be identifying yourself in such a way through signing, back in the day, signing a check, that kind of thing, signing the deeds to your property. If you print your name, or even, again, the meaning might change, the purpose might change. If you type your name, then we're talking about a material change in the practice. You'll be using something else other than a pen and paper to type your name, and so on. So I have a book there in the corner. It's called The Dynamics of Social Practice. It was written by Shove, Watson and Pansar, and it's available everywhere. It's a great read on understanding practice. Now, the other thing I think is incredibly important when we integrate these three elements is we know what good looks like. We have a sense of taste, and others have a different taste. Yeah. So when I, for example, when I write a Sharpie, a Post-it note as an agile coach back in the day, I would tend to want to use good sticky notes, super stickies. I want to use Sharpie pens, and I would write in block capitals, so that I have a kind of a sense of what good looks like in the use of, this is ridiculous, in the use of using a Post-it note. But I have a taste for that. I know what it likes, what it good looks like. If I was to see someone using a biro pen and curling up the corners of a Post-it note as they wrote it, I would feel that that's, I need to help them develop their skills in this space, give them new materials to use in order to do it better. So taste allows us to critique. It allows us to critique what others do, what we do ourselves. One example I like to think about here is taste is, think of how you might react when you see someone in the supermarket in their pajamas, in their nightwear. Like you would, I wouldn't be seen dead wearing that, right? This might be your reaction. It's not what good looks like in that context. So understanding taste allows us to have aspirations. Next time I'll do better. If only we could do it like this. So it allows us to have a contextual, you maybe see where I'm going with this, a contextual perspective on maturity and what good looks like. So there's me writing my name. That's what I feel good looks like when I write my name. When I wrote it in my left hand, less so. That's not what good looks like. I have a lot, if I want to have it like it is on the left hand side there, I need to either develop my skills or just pick up the pen with the other hand, use that knowledge that in my left hand I'm not so good at writing. That is genuinely how I wrote my name in my left hand. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do an S. It's quite sad. So the other thing that's really important to consider here is taste and practice is contextual. Like back to my pajamas example, it's okay to wear your pajamas in the bedroom, but not at the supermarket. Yeah, taste is contextual. What good looks like is contextual, and context is incredibly important. So Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, uses this phrase, it's when he adapted, called habitus. And he says that habitus, which is like context, comprises of socially ingrained habits, skills, and dispositions. It's the way that individuals perceive the world around them and react to it. So I'd argue that context is comprised of a network of practices, how they're configured, how they relate, when they relate, and the dispositional outcome of these conditions and interactions that make it up. Context is incredibly important. And having a practice sensibility, to use a term by practice theorist Stephen Kemmis, it encourages to see what we do as a complex dance of interrelated meanings, materials, and competencies. It helps us make sense of the world and how we know, how we believe we should act in it, how we cognise what affordances we have that enable us to act, what competence we need in order to act, and what constraints exist in that context. And when we consider what to change, we can then encourage to think about the kind of appropriateness of meanings and how meanings relate, and how change can be accelerated or constrained by different materials and different competencies, and then how all of this then relates. Okay, so social practice theory, there's a bit of that what we've just discussed is a bit of a grounding as to where we'll kind of go forward here now to start to answer the more practical questions. So if we go back to the capability questions, like how do we know what we have with regards to capabilities? We could use a maturity model, perhaps. I would argue, however, that maturity models are static. They don't evolve as contexts evolve. They are potentially, in some cases, linear. The one you see right in the middle there has a series of linear steps you have to go to become mature. They are unarguably context-free. Even assessing yourself in them does not give you your context. It gives you your assessment against the maturity model, but it doesn't describe for you your context. So I guess the question for me then is, does anyone know where I can find a maturity model for public sector pension administration in Scotland? Hands up, anyone? It doesn't exist. So to understand maturity and how we kind of facilitate the conversation around maturity, Mark and I have developed a canvas, this we call maturity mapping canvas, and there's two. These are both the same, the two images there, but one's from Mural and one's from sort of Miro, and it kind of helps us understand context using a practice theory lens. So we developed this. It gives us provides us with a facilitation constraints. It helps us unravel a context and then decide and track what to do with it. So the aspects of this here is probably too small to see. It asks us about context, customer needs, measures, objective measures we can use on a particular context, the activities that take place in that context, aka practices. And we're more tending now to talk about activities because practices makes people, I guess, brings people into a way of thinking that we're, without a full discussion about what practice theory is, makes it slightly more difficult to have that conversation. So we focus on activities. We then do practice analysis, which will show you with maps. It's a mapping conference. We use a Wardley map, and then we experiment, and we use the kind of maps to hold the context, and then using the experiment plans to have that kind of feedback loop. So step one on this canvas is we determine the context we're interested in and why. So what is the space of the context that we want to examine and look for improvements? What we're not going to examine, and this kind of helps us focus our mind, and it's something as we facilitate we constantly go back to discuss. Steps 2 and 3, very familiar to in the Wardley mapping space, is that we understand what and whose needs are being served in this context. What's the customer? What's their needs? Then crucially at step 5, we start to ask the questions about what is done in this context in order to meet these needs. What are the things we do? One thing here to consider is this lovely little model that was introduced to us by Mario Platt, who's in the Wardley mapping community. It's developed by a gentleman called Stephen Sharrock, and he mostly uses it in healthcare. It helps us think about and kind of consider how deep we want to delve into a context in order to sort of believe you have enough information to understand the context and then take appropriate action. It's a model that describes how we understand work. So first we have on the left-hand side in the red, we have work as imagined. And that's how people who don't do the work imagine work may be done. So it could be that they're experts who had once worked in a field, have a belief of how it should be done, but over time your memory of how it's done fades and your experience kind of fades. Then we have work as disclosed, and this is how the people who do the work describe how they do the work. This is what people say they do when they do the work. We have work as prescribed. That's kind of how people believe should be done, those who set the rules, those who maybe write the manuals or do the training. And then after all that, we have work as done. This is how it is actually done on the ground. So depending how deep you want to go into this context, how much you feel you really need to understand in order to develop maps and have utility from those maps, you could potentially, through work as imagined, ask experts, how is work done here? Or you could then go deeper and ask workers, how do you do your work? Or you could do ethnographic observation and observe how work is done. Depends on where you believe you can get utility from what you do. Possibly, work as prescribed is maybe something that it's not something we've explored as a way of actually mapping. It's a way of learning about a context and how things might work, yes, but not necessarily for mapping. So that step 5 I was talking about, where we start to say, tell us all of the things you do. We kind of explore what it is we do, what happens. So we think about what are the routine things we do, think about team activities, meetings, individual activities people do. Maybe if we're dealing with teams of senior managers, we say, look in your diaries, tell me what meetings you attend. And that drives people to remember and think about what they do. Maybe even a way of exploring this to say, tell us all the things you use, all the tools you use. And from that helps us facilitate a conversation about what people do. But to show here that depending on the context, we could end up with complex networks of practices or linear processes of practices. And one of the example at the top there of the value stream is one I've done very recently, which was an operational process in the pensions agency, where we're looking at a series of steps done to administer pension applications. But that's not enough. The next approach we take is to analyse each thing done, each practice that's done. So we know the things, but we want to maybe know how they relate, what the kind of what people's the kind of various elements of the practice that people that understand, and kind of what their taste is. What does good look like, and what aspirations do they have? So we've developed practice cards. This is a quite elaborate practice card. I should have an animation in this slide, which lets me show you 2 levels to them. But crucially, what we have in a practice card is meaning and purpose. Why do we carry out this practice? Materials. What are the things we use to do the practice? And what does doing it well look like? And this much more elaborate practice card asks many more questions. So it asks us to think about currently how things are done. We don't normally ask that question. It asks us what data tells us, what do we know about the information, the data we have at a particular stage, and what is needed to carry out activity, what inputs are, and then typically who does it. We're also maybe interested in the skills people need to have. But crucially, this question to the left, the WGLL, what does good look like? So this is, I guess, is the first material difference to Wardley mapping. And we developed practice cards to help us facilitate and document a conversation around a practice that's done. We can go back to the 3 elements of social practice theory, and you can overlay. So meanings and purposes here around why. We have knowledge and procedure and how things are known and done as is. We have then tools that are used, data, inputs, etc. There'll be more material elements to it. The next then question is, how do we know what we can change? How can we make a change and improve our situation? And then this is where the map comes in. This is where we then map our practices. So this is a Wardley map. We use this for maturity mapping. As you can see, it has the same X and Y axis. The Y axis is around visibility. The X axis we kind of label here as maturity in this context as opposed to evolution. We can maybe talk a little about that later. And we've slightly adapted a guide, or we've contextualized the guide so that on the X-axis, while the labels are the same, concept, emerging, good and better, amongst the selections of labels that we can put on a Wardley map, it's not just Genesis, custom, product, commodity. If you look at Simon's guides, there are various different, depending on what you're mapping, there are various different key guides you can put in. But what we've done with our kind of a pseudo lightweight cheat sheet is we've kind of described the various stages we see practice go through, from awareness to getting to grips with, to doing some aspects repeatedly, to doing all aspects consistently, and the various levels of improvement we believe that's needed at each of these stages. So then in mapping, and here's that practice card that I showed you a second ago, we can take a practice from our practice network that we've established and say, where do you believe this practice should exist? i.e., the way you have described what doing it well looks like, what good looks like, how would you evaluate what you believe doing it well looks like against where it fits in the X-axis? We can say, are we getting to grips with it? Actually, we're beginning to see shoots of doing it well. Is it something we see done? We can see aspects of doing it well repeatedly. There's maybe, if you just to think about this simplistically, if you look at doing it well as a checklist, are there aspects of that you could check off on a repeated basis? Or invest, there are aspects of doing it well that you check off all the time. You do, no, not just aspects, you check that off all the time. You do the same thing, doing aspects repeatedly all the time. And you could then consider the practice and the practicing of that practice as an example of what good looks like. Then we map the rest of the practices following the same way we would normally map things on a Wardley map. Again, sorry, when I say the same way, it depends on the context and how we would bring things to a map. Complex networks, we tend to bring one at a time and establish connections. More understood value chains or value streams, we can bring them over in larger batches and look at them and bring them onto the map. Just not going to go through this map and talk about the elements of the map, but you see or the individual components or practices on the map, but you see a customer, you see their need, you see the practices used, network of practices used to meet their need, the ones that relate directly to them, how visible they are, how mature they are. And I would add just one more thing that we have done in practice that I was thinking earlier on about Simon's additional iconography he's using on maps, is that we would suggest that maybe this red line, or this maybe, depending on how we use it, we might use a broken line, would suggest that the relationship between these two practices requires attention, requires improvement. So it's not just about where practices are positioned, but the connections between them and the relationships between them would suggest that that's an area of focus for improvement. So the next question is, how would we like to improve our situation? We understand our situation, we have that situational awareness. Now we want to make things better. So one thing key here, it's a complex environments we're looking in. We're not playing fantasy football. You can't get what you want. You can't just say, well, let's move everything to the right. That's exactly what we want to do. To quote, I think it's Anna from Frozen 2, my children were watching that the other day. We ask ourselves, what is the next right thing? We can't see everything, or we can't determine exactly all of the paths that will be taken or could be taken. We ask ourselves, what's the next right thing? And we quite like this phrase by Stuart Kaufman called the adjacent possible. So we consider, when we are looking to improve, what is the adjacent possible? And that's a kind of shadow future hovering on the edge of the present state of things, a map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. The adjacent possible captures both the limits and the creative potential of change and innovation in a space. Something else that we do in this space, but I won't go into, is we sometimes use a practice from the Cynefin family practices called Four Corners contextualization, which helps us understand what that adjacent possible may be. So how do we then describe our movement on a map? Again, this is sort of a slight difference, I suspect, in how between maturity mapping and Wardley mapping, is that we look at movement in all directions. Going back to what Simon said earlier on as he was introducing Wardley Maps, space has meaning, but we think there's meaning in movement across the various spaces of a map. And the kind of patterns that we've recognised would suggest that we call movement to the right maturing, we call that developing. Movement to the left, we call that reconfiguring. And that is to say that the practices, the three elements of that practice, we might be removing aspects of it and introducing new aspects of it, but on the whole, we're looking to do the same practice. So we might change the tool, for example, in a practice to try and get more value from that practice. We have expose, the idea that we have a practice that we want to sort of take towards the customer so they have more awareness of it. We can get more interaction with our customers in the practicing of this practice. Simple example here is, imagine doing user research and without letting the people you're researching know you're researching them, without them engaging and being part of research, without them contributing to research. You then might want to move that practice further up on the map, make it more visible to them. You may have practices that you believe that are hinder the conversation you have with your customers, so you might want to hide them. We see less of this, but you might want to bring them down. Then you might want to introduce a new practice, or you might want to introduce a new practice with the purpose of competing with an existing practice, so that you might want to eradicate practice. So those of you in the software development world, we might be looking at unit testing as an incumbent practice, whereas we want to bring in test-driven development because we believe there's more value. So that is a new practice we're going to bring in to compete with the incumbent practice of after the fact unit testing or after the code unit testing. So our map that we looked at earlier on for the pension schemes could look something like this. Now we've made the decisions on what we want to do. Again, to go back to the one earlier on, we want to improve the relationship between the two practices at the bottom of calculating benefits and sending for authorization. The practice of indexing we want to remove because we believe it doesn't add the value we hope we could get from it. We actually do it well, but it isn't a practice we feel there's value in. So we want to maybe take the outcomes, the meanings of that practice and find them a new home. And then our practice there in the to the left of application checks, this is something we want to interact better with our customers on in order to get more value from that practice. So we want to both develop, mature, move right, and expose, move north, move up towards our member. So I think I kind of coming to the end now. So I guess I want to talk a little bit, just sort of round off a little bit, saying improving execution is changing what we do. It's improving what we do. And with maturity mapping and its use of practice theory and looking through that practice lens, we want to shift the focus from the individual and the actions of the individual, a psychological focus, to that of a social focus and on the practices, the things we do and share. So looking through the practice lens, we can see organisations as they are, as socio-technical complex systems. Practice lens encourages us to see wholes and integration and interdependence, and think not just about the behaviours and motivations of individuals, but through a practice lens, understand what we do together that can be observed and shared. Bruno Latour would say work then as a site of practice, work is a site of practice, and workers then are seen as practitioners. So again, just to repeat, a practice sensibility and using that practice, using practice as a central unit of analysis, kind of lets us know it's not just about things like your mindset or the tools at disposal or people and process. It's about the complex dance of interrelated meanings, materials and competencies. it matters how we make sense of the world, how we know, how we believe we should act, how we understand the affordances we have that enable us to act, and what competencies we have in order to act. And also what constraints there are that exist in an environment that that either enables or restricts our acting and our practice. It helps us kind of consider what things are shared in our environment and how other things might or might not be compatible, how we might bring things in and how they may or may not work well with the current context, and how we consider what to change in the meanings, materials, and the competencies and how they interrelate. Almost, and I'll leave you with a slight modification of this this saying by Andrew Clay Schaefer. Simon mentioned Andrew earlier on when he talked about DevOps. So transformation, change is not an event. It is the progressive accumulation of habits. To adapt that slightly and bring in one of Andrew's friends, and Jay Bloom, would say maybe that it's not progressive accumulation of habits, but of practices, and progressive change of practices. Okay, one more thing, Columbo, and I'll be done. Some of you may be saying, isn't this just Wardley mapping? If we think about the differences that exist from what I've described using a social practice lens, we can see Wardley mapping has a meaning for strategy. The materials we use are the Wardley map, the doctrine, things like that, the gameplays. The competence is understanding the patterns. It's definitely understanding how to map, and the knowledge, which I think is interesting, of the components that exist on the map. Maturity mapping would suggest that there's whereas a kind of sense that Wardley mapping has a material bias. We talk about evolution through supply and demand. That's evolution of things. Most likely practice co-evolves, as we kind of said at the start. But maturity mapping has the bias towards the competence, the way in which we do the things. And the meaning, we believe, is understanding change and improvement. Materials are most certainly Wardley maps. The competence then becomes about practice analysis, and shared with Wardley mapping, it's about mapping, the practice of mapping. Wardley mapping maybe senses errs towards what you have or want to have, whereas with maturity mapping, it's about what you do and want to do. Wardley mapping may have a bias towards competition and what happens on the outside, whereas maturity mapping may have a bias towards collaboration. Measurement in Wardley mapping is measured on the outside. It's the evolutionary axis of how things evolve in the world, whereas we use that evolutionary axis in a more centrally contextual way. How do we use the aspects of that measure where we are in context and where we are now? And that's me. Thank you. Would anyone like to, we have 15 minutes before the next session. Would anyone like to jump on and have a chat, ask some questions, or would you like to pop some questions in the text chat?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've seen that you have a way of introducing new practices, that you showed that competing maybe with old practices. How would you show obliterated practices you actually have abandoned, but are you showing this? It has a value to do this, for me at least.
So that's depending on the context we're exploring, not just the context or a space in which things happen, but why are we interested in drawing this map? If we're interested in drawing this map to see what may have been done, what happened in the past, then bringing those practices in. I can't really recollect us doing this, but I can certainly see the need for it. Where it might fit on the x-axis might be when we last remember doing it and what we believe good looked like at that time. And as maturity mapping itself is a practice which is very in the Genesis space, I would suggest that you'd be I would love to kind of explore how we might depict it, how might it look, some X practice. In a practice theory sense, practice has kind of 3 stages in which practice exists in practice theory. One is proto-practice. That is, we have a meaning, we have competence, we have material, but we've not brought them together and closed the loop to create the practice. Then there's practice, like I've described, and then there's X practice, and that's the obliviated practice I think you're talking about, is the meaning, we know what the meaning was, we may still have the competencies, we might have material, but we don't close that loop anymore. We don't integrate the 3.
I think the idea is interesting from if you want to know the evolution of things, right? If you look at an organization, a bigger organization, and where one part wants to learn from the other part, and having this in the map, they can learn from this. So we evolved from this to this, right? So very interesting. This was very inspirational for me. Really, really
cool. Thank you.
Thanks for the answer.
I'd happy to, this is a offer with all. I'd happy to discuss, and if anyone wants to get in touch, my details are on the speaker page, Twitter and LinkedIn and things. So,
thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? It's getting to that point, and it's getting near the conference beer time. Does that work, Holger, when we're remote? How do we do conference beer?
I also just have coffee for now, but I also have a question. But first, thank you so much for the presentation. There's a lot to digest there. So my questions will reflect that, I think. But I have a follow-up question just to try to untangle some concepts, trying to get the grips, especially with the granularity of the way you use practice in social practice theory context, and comparing it to some other things. So as I understand it, we're using practice in this context both for really compound practices like the one you're describing, and for low granularity practices as well. So what would be some typical differences? I understand they are completely separate things, but what is the difference between a practice in this context and, for example, a use case on one hand? Because some of the titles that you used in the slides that you showed could also be interpreted as that. So use cases on one hand, and on the other hand, more Alexandrian patterns, perhaps more the organizational patterns as captured by Coplien and the others. What would be important differences between those?
So I maybe I have to give me an example of use cases, but let me think about the Coplien and the organizational patterns. I think they are like any of the models, and I kind of jokingly have a stab at maturity models going through this, and I think there is value in maturity models just for saying that they are decontextualized experience, and that's what I think the Coplien's sort of patterns are. Alexander's patterns are the same thing. They are decontextualized experience. There are things that we have seen a number of times. I would say that the interesting thing, if you examine a context, it then become about how you want to integrate, or sorry, better term, contextualize that experience into that context. So if you see the need for a pattern, whether it's, so if you maybe think of the software example again, because it's something I'm familiar with in the past. If you look at teams who do not do, I don't know, continuous integration, but want to do continuous delivery, for example, you can see a pattern of failure emerging in there. So you want to try and say, how would we integrate continuous integration? That then allows you to then explore what other practices they have that we believe are complementary. So that model exists. So the pattern, I guess, gives us a lens in which to look at a context to see where we might want to evolve and change it. You'd need to give me an example of use case You talk Alistair Coburn's kind of use of use case or story.
It was very much in general, like a description of a scenario in which a user interacts with the system, and the system typically being in a technological system in this case. So you had some examples in earlier slides for I believe interacting with a pension system, so performing different acts with that. But as I understood it, you capture that as a practice as well. So the question is rather, when we try to describe what functionality the system is meant to extend and expose to the users, what would be the difference between thinking in that perspective and viewing this as practices in a larger system? It might not make sense as a question, but
no,
that
I think
just
it depends. So again, it depends on the context in which you're using user stories or using use cases. If you're using use cases to describe what you want, then you're casting forward to future practices. If you're using use cases to describe what you do now, there's kind of potential for Simon's argument about stories and maps, where you are describing what it is, whereas the map allows us to see. I guess it depends on what you want to do. If you want to change and improve a situation, then the map in practice gives you the visual where something exists, where the story might be, the use case is a way in which you articulate to others what your needs and wants are, I guess, and not what your current situation is.
So just on that topic, I was many years ago, as Jim Coplin did this exercise with us in our organization, where it's kind of like a technique in terms of having people around the table using CRC cards. Remember the CRC cards? Yep. And then mapping the practices based on the simple exercise of the ball comes in, the customer comes in, and then you throw the ball around and you track the different practices in terms of how you answer to that customer. And that was actually the input to the organizational patterns. Right. Doing some analysis on those on the results of those workshops. So there might be an interesting link there.
And another facilitation idea of how to map practices and understand practices with a ball.
Yeah, exactly.
Chris, I have a question. It's Rasmus here.
Hey, Rasmus.
In terms of the actual maturity mapping, when you see that's done and kind of the transformation to the next new state, I have a question related to the level of impact versus the size within the different dots. So let's say you have 3 maturity maps, and you have to decide which 2 actions are the most impactful ones across those 3 maps. Are you somehow gauging the impact of moving, or like time, or the impact across maybe different processes, so either the dot becomes larger or smaller, or in somehow show the weight of the actual change? So let's say you improve one, and then that has a 50 to 100%, maybe 100 to 200% improvement compared to another dot that you move.
So we don't visualize that. I think that's interesting. And actually, I see Patrick here. Patrick and I had a conversation maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago about cornerstone practices and sort of Donella Meadows' idea of leverage points in a system. So looking at practices, and we do that, but we've not visualized that. We've not kind of said where would be the way in which you would say you kind of had impact or got benefit. You just see the context change. I guess the Mark more so than I talks about, as practices move to the right, we expect to see more value from those practices. We get more value. And so again, the kind of, I guess, the depiction of things more on the right hand side gives in essence that view of that we're getting more value from what we do, and then have a greater impact with what we do. But with regards to visualizing the kind of impact and change based, like just growing, and we haven't thought about that, but that's an interesting one. As to then the kind of how do we visualize X practices, and how do we visualize practices, the kind of impact of those practices?
Yeah, the level of impact, at least somehow, so I can decide which one to focus on first.
Yeah.
Basically.
There's a couple of questions on the right hand side there. So, can we try to map cultural maturity of an organisation? I don't. So, I wonder if Mark's around. He can jump in as well here. But the culture, I think, is an emergent property of the things we do. Cultural maturity would suggest, I guess, there is a set of practices or a set of ways in which we would expect to see in order for it to be mature. Simon has done this. He has mapped culture. He did this a few years ago on a Wardley map, but it's not something that I think we've tried. Again, it's not something I've tried. Maybe Mark has. Oh, he's in the garden. He can't come on camera. I guess the practical question then for Margot is time and people intensive. Again, this depends on how, I mean, it's such a consultant answer, but it depends on how deep you want to go. I recently got utility from going through that canvas with a group of 3 or 4 people within the space of an hour and a half. It was a very well understood context, but what I found was that I used it as a way to facilitate the conversation, because I felt the conversation wasn't, there was too much emotion in the conversation, so I brought it out of the kind of unvisualized into a visualized context and said, let's quickly draw this thing we do, where are your aspirations for each of these things, and we didn't necessarily linearly follow the canvas. We kind of bounced around the bits of the canvas, and what good looks like we really determined based on the key practices that were of interest, where the real problems were. It was a communications, a sort of interaction process between customers, sort of making queries of the organisation to help them with pensions again, help them understand where's my case, when are you going to do my thing, or failure demand type things, and we recognised quite quickly points for the process where that failure was. So the other aspect, the other side of this is that we have got a kind of pattern approach we take, where we will work with experts of the space to get the work as imagined. We don't map that, but what we do is we use that as a guide to go to teams, and we would spend time with maybe the team leads and teams to say, how do you work? And that's a 2 or 3 hour process. And then what we would do is follow up with a couple of hours with a wider team to say, in this context, this is how the map has been drawn by the leads and people you have got, there's relationships with in a team, and we'd say, well, let's validate that, let's move that around, let's validate what good looks like and where things are. And it could take longer, it could take a day or more. Again, it depends on the granularity, it depends what you're looking to achieve and how knowable it is. I see Mark has answered the culture question, and we are at time. Twitter's there, LinkedIn as well. If anyone has any, my details are on the front on the schedule page. If anyone wants to follow up and have a chat, I'd love to chat more. So, thank you, everyone. Bye.